Most comedians, when they sit down across from a host, want to make people laugh. Patrice O'Neal wanted to win, not in the petty sense, not in the sense of scoring points or getting the last word for its own sake. He wanted to win, to pursue the truest, most honest, most unassailable version of an argument until the other person had nowhere left to go, and then sit there, completely comfortable in the silence, while the room figured out what had just happened. He did this on radio shows, he did this on talk shows, he did it on Opie and Anthony. He did it with hosts who thought they were going to steer the conversation, with co-panelists who thought they had him cornered, with audience members who thought a question was a challenge, and with women who came in ready for a fight and left the conversation looking at the world slightly differently than when they'd entered it. He lost arguments sometimes, he'd say so himself, but he lost them the way a lion occasionally loses a race, not because the other animal is stronger, but because the terrain was different that day. What Patrice O'Neal did in debate, in conversation, in the specific, unrepeatable art form of the argument as comedy performance, is something that hasn't been replicated since his death in 2011. It probably can't be, because the combination of things that made him devastating in an argument, the intelligence, the honesty, the refusal to accept false premises, the ability to hold a position under enormous social pressure without flinching, those things don't cluster in one person very often. This is Patrice O'Neal winning every argument, who was Patrice O'Neal. Patrice O'Neal was born in 1969 Roxbury, Massachusetts, a historically black neighborhood in Boston, with a complicated and often difficult relationship with the surrounding city. He grew up in circumstances that were not easy. His relationship with his mother was intense and defining. The streets he came up on were streets that demanded a kind of quick, analytical thinking about human behavior, about who was playing games and who wasn't, about what people said and what they actually meant. He discovered stand-up in his early 20s and was, from the very beginning, unusual. His material wasn't primarily about his life, though his life informed it. It was primarily about ideas, about gender, about relationships, about the mechanics of how men and women relate to each other, about the way society structures what people are allowed to say and think and feel. He moved to New York and ground through the club circuit, and he was, for most of that time, a beloved comedian's comedian. Someone whose peers and industry insiders knew was extraordinary without the mainstream recognition ever quite catching up. He appeared on television, had acting roles, did clubs and theaters, but never broke through in the way that his talent perhaps should have produced. Part of this was timing. Part of it was that his material was not, in the most literal sense, designed to make everyone comfortable. He was not doing the kind of comedy that earned universal approval, because universal approval requires a certain amount of strategic softening, and Patrice O'Neal did not strategically soften things. He became most widely known, at least during his lifetime, through his long association with the Opie and Anthony show, a terrestrial and later satellite radio show based in New York, where Patrice became a permanent fixture, dropping in multiple times a week for years. It was on that show, in hours and hours of unscripted, unedited radio conversation, that the fullest version of Patrice O'Neal as a thinker and debater was captured for posterity. He suffered a massive stroke in October 2011 and died in December of that year at the age of 41. He left behind a devoted following of comedians, fans, and people who had found something in his work that they couldn't quite find anywhere else, a kind of radical, uncomfortable, frequently hilarious honesty about human nature that made most other public conversation feel like performance by comparison. In the years since his death, his reputation has grown enormously. Clips of his radio appearances have become fixtures on YouTube, each one reliably accumulating millions of views, introduced to new audiences by algorithms that apparently understand something that his industry never fully did. People are hungry for someone who says what he actually thinks. The argument as art form. Before we get into specific examples of Patrice winning arguments, we need to understand what he was doing structurally when he argued, because it was not what most people do when they argue. Most arguments in everyday life, in public discourse, on television panel, shows follow a recognizable pattern. Person A has a position. Person B challenges it. Person A defends it. The defense involves either marshaling more evidence for the original position or retreating slightly from it while appearing not to. Eventually, one person stops pushing, not because they've been convinced, but because the argument is exhausting or because the social cost of continuing has become too high. Patrice didn't argue this way. He argued in a way that was almost forensic. He started by identifying the actual premise underneath the stated position, because in his view, most arguments are lost before they start, because the people having them have accepted a premise they shouldn't have accepted. Once he identified the unstated premise, he either accepted it or challenged it. And his challenges of premises were often more devastating than his challenges to conclusions, because if you can show that the ground someone is standing on isn't solid, the whole structure comes down. He was also extraordinary at something less commonly discussed. He was honest about his own side of an argument. He would give up points he couldn't defend. He would acknowledge when a challenge landed. He did not confuse winning an argument with never conceding a point. He understood that sometimes you have to give up the indefensible to hold the line on what's actually true. And he was patient. He would let an argument breathe. He would let the other person talk. He was not interrupting to score a point or to prevent the other person from making one. He wanted the other person to make their best case, because he was confident in his ability to respond to the best case. He didn't need a weak version of the opposing argument. He was fine with the strong version. This patience was itself sometimes the most devastating weapon. He'd let someone build and build, elaborating their position, seeming to gain confidence as they talked, and then respond to the whole thing with a single sentence that made everything they just said collapse. The gender arguments. Patrice O'Neal's most famous arguments, the ones that have been viewed most widely on YouTube, the ones that people still quote and discuss, are his arguments about gender, relationships, and the dynamics between men and women. This territory is genuinely charged. It is the territory where the most social pressure exists to say specific things, to perform specific positions, and where deviation from the expected script carries the highest immediate cost in the form of audience hostility or host discomfort. It is also, therefore, the territory where Patrice's willingness to say exactly what he thought, without adjustment for the room's comfort level, was most stark and most visible. His argument, stated simply, was that modern culture had created a framework for understanding male-female relationships that was dishonest in specific ways, that the dishonesty served certain interests and not others, that the people most invested in the framework being maintained were often the most uncomfortable when it was examined directly, and that a genuinely honest conversation about how men and women actually relate to each other looked very different from the conversation that was considered acceptable. This sounds like it could be the prelude to something reactionary or mean-spirited. In Patrice's delivery, it almost never was. What was striking about watching him make these arguments in real time, in the radio clips, in the television appearances, was how philosophically serious they were. He wasn't venting grievance. He was making observations and following them where they went, even when where they went was uncomfortable. He also had a quality that is extremely rare in this specific territory. He could articulate the other side's position clearly and charitably before he took it apart. He wasn't defeating a straw man. He was engaging with the strongest version of the position he disagreed with, and showing why he still disagreed. One of the recurring patterns in his gender arguments was his challenge to what he called dishonesty about attraction, about desire, about what men and women actually want from each other, as opposed to what they publicly claim to want. He believed the gap between those two things was enormous, and that comedy specifically, the kind of honest comedy he was trying to do, was one of the few spaces where that gap could be examined without the conversation immediately collapsing into defensiveness or performance. He'd get the audience laughing at something, and then, in the same breath, make them sit with the thing they'd just laughed at its implications, its honesty, what it said about them that they found it funny. It was a sophisticated move, using laughter as a door into territory that direct argument would have closed off. The Star Jones moment. One of the most widely circulated Patrice O'Neal clips online is a television appearance in which he sits across from Star Jones on a panel discussing some aspect of male-female relationships, the kind of segment that exists on daytime and early evening television in large quantities, and usually produces a large amount of heat and very little light. What happened in that segment was not that. What happened was Patrice O'Neal doing something live on daytime television that almost never happens in that format. He made an argument that couldn't be dismissed. Jones, who is a sharp and experienced television personality, came in with the energy that the format typically rewards confident, ready to push back, representing a position she'd clearly represented many times before. The expectation implicit in the format, was that Patrice would deliver a provocation, she would deliver a counter, the host would moderate the resulting excitement, and everyone would go to commercial having expressed their predetermined positions. Patrice declined to cooperate with this structure. Instead of delivering a provocation designed to generate heat, he delivered an argument, a careful, specific, followed-through argument, with premises and evidence and an internal logic that held together even under challenge. Jones pushed back. He responded to the pushback. She pushed back again. He responded again. And this time, the response went somewhere the format wasn't designed to accommodate it. Went to a place where the audience was no longer reacting with tribal enthusiasm for whichever side they came in rooting for, but was actually sitting with the thing that had been said, because the thing that had been said was difficult to dismiss. What's remarkable about watching this clip, even years later, is the moment where you can see Jones recalibrate. She does not concede the point that would be television death in the format they're in, but she shifts her approach, which is its own form of concession. She goes from engaging with the argument to rerouting around it, which is what you do when you realize the argument is harder to answer than you expected. Patrice noticed this. He didn't celebrate it or point to it. He just waited pleasantly for what she was going to say next. The Opie and Anthony arguments. The Opie and Anthony show was, for about a decade, one of the most important incubators of the kind of comedy and conversation Patrice O'Neal was doing, and the radio format was in many ways the natural home for what he was actually good at. Radio, unlike television, does not care how you look. It does not have a clock that demands you wrap up in 90 seconds. It does not have a host whose primary goal is to keep things comfortable and send you to commercial on a laugh. It is just voices and time. And the person with the most interesting voice, not the most beautiful or the most performed, but the most interesting, tends to win. Patrice O'Neal had the most interesting voice in the room, almost always. The arguments he had on Opie and Anthony ranged across everything: race, gender, politics, entertainment, celebrity, human psychology, the nature of honesty, the nature of dishonesty, the specific mechanics of how people fool themselves. He argued with the hosts. He argued with call-in listeners. He argued with other comedians who were guests on the show. He argued with positions that the other people in the room hadn't even fully articulated yet. He'd identify the assumption underneath what someone was saying and respond to that, which often left the person he was talking to momentarily bewildered because their stated position hadn't been challenged. Only its foundation had been removed. He also laughed, constantly. This is an important point about Patrice O'Neal that sometimes gets lost in the clips. He was funny. Deeply, organically funny. The arguments were not delivered with the solemnity of a lecture or the aggression of a debate. They were delivered with genuine humor, genuine warmth, and a specific delight in the act of thinking out loud with other people. He seemed to genuinely enjoy the process, even when the content was serious. This made him essentially impossible to dismiss. If he had been angry and humorless, his arguments could have been waved away as grievance. If he had been purely funny without the substance, they could have been waved away as entertainment. He was both things at once, simultaneously, which meant the only way to deal with what he was saying was to actually deal with it. The technique, how he won. Let's get specific about technique, because Patrice O'Neal winning arguments wasn't magic, it was method. Even if the method was so internalized that it looked effortless, he refused false premises. This is the foundational move. Most arguments are built on a premise that nobody has examined, and if you're willing to stop and examine the premise before engaging with the argument, you often discover that the entire structure is unstable. Patrice did this habitually. He'd pause a conversation that had been going somewhere at speed and say, essentially, wait, what are we actually agreeing to here? And often that question alone would reorient the entire discussion. He made the other person say what they actually meant. He had an extraordinary ability to identify when someone was speaking in code, when the socially acceptable version of a position was being stated while a different, less socially acceptable version was the one actually being held. He would gently, patiently insist on the real version. He wasn't cruel about it, but he wouldn't move forward until the honest version of the position was on the table. He separated the question of what's true from the question of what's comfortable. He understood that many arguments in public life are conducted with an implicit agreement not to say things that are true if those things are uncomfortable. He did not honor this agreement. He was willing to say uncomfortable things if he believed they were true, and he separated that question, "Is this true?" from the separate question of whether it was pleasant or convenient or popular. He was genuinely open to being wrong. This sounds minor, but it's actually enormous. He wasn't performing openness while secretly being closed. He would change his position in the middle of a conversation if someone made a point that genuinely moved him. This made everything he said carry more weight. Because when he didn't change his position, you understood that it wasn't stubbornness. It was that the challenge, genuinely, hadn't been strong enough. He used humor to lower defenses, then moved quickly. He would make the room laugh at a thing, and while the laughter was still happening, he would follow the thing to its conclusion, somewhere the room might not have followed if he'd gone there directly. Laughter opens a door. He walked through it. The arguments about honesty. There is a meta-level to Patrice O'Neal's arguments that is worth discussing separately. Many of his most significant arguments were not about specific topics, but about the act of argument itself, about honesty, about what it costs to say true things, about why people don't. He was fascinated, almost obsessed, in a productive way, with the gap between what people believed and what they said. He saw this gap everywhere. In relationships, in public discourse, in the comedy industry, in the way television conversation was structured. And he believed that the gap was not accidental. It was maintained actively because closing it was expensive. Saying true things costs something. Not saying them is free, or at least it looks free. And most people, most of the time, make the rational choice. Patrice was constitutionally unable to make that rational choice, or he had simply decided not to. The distinction matters, because he was smart enough to understand exactly what saying certain things would cost him, which means his choice to say them anyway was a genuine choice, not a failure of social awareness. He talked about this directly on multiple occasions about the cost of honesty, about the specific loneliness of being someone who says what he actually thinks in a room where nobody else does. He didn't romanticize this loneliness. He found it frustrating. He wanted more people to be honest with him, and they mostly weren't, and he found that genuinely sad. His arguments about honesty were, in this sense, not just about winning. They were appeals. He was trying to get the person across from him to meet him somewhere real, somewhere without performance, somewhere where the actual conversation could happen. When it worked, when the person he was talking to dropped the script and responded to what he was actually saying, you could see him light up in a way that was distinct from the satisfaction of winning. He didn't just want to win, he wanted a real conversation. Winning was what happened when nobody would give him one. The legacy. Patrice O'Neal died on the 9th of December 2011. He was 41 years old. He had suffered a stroke 6 weeks earlier that left him unable to speak. And when he died, the comedy community that had always known who he was reacted with a specific grief reserved for the loss of something that felt irreplaceable because it was. In the years since his death, the scale of his influence has become more visible. Comedians across the spectrum, Dave Chappelle, Bill Burr, Jim Norton, Colin Quinn, and many others have spoken about him with a reverence that goes beyond normal tribute. Not just, he was a great comedian, but he changed the way I thought about what I was doing, which is a different category of compliment entirely. His friend Bill Burr, in particular, has spoken at length about Patrice's influence on his own thinking, crediting conversations with Patrice for shaping how he approached material, how he thought about honesty, and how he navigated the specific pressures of public life as a comedian who doesn't always say what audiences want to hear. The YouTube clips have taken on a life of their own, and they reveal something important. Patrice O'Neal was not just a comedian. He was a philosopher. Not in the academic sense, he would have found that description hilarious, but in the older sense, someone who pursued genuine understanding of how things are, not how we'd like them to be, and who communicated that understanding in a way that ordinary people could follow and engage with. His arguments about gender, about race, about honesty, about the nature of relationships, they were not polished positions worked out in advance. They were thinking out loud, in real time, in conversation. And because they were genuine thinking rather than performance, they hold up. You can listen to a Patrice O'Neal argument from 15 years ago and find that it's not dated. It's still pointing at something true, something that hasn't resolved itself just because time has passed. That's rare. That's the mark of someone who was actually saying something, not just winning the room. There are a lot of smart people in the world. There are a lot of honest people. There are a lot of funny people. And there are a lot of people who are good at arguing. The thing about Patrice O'Neal is that he was all of those things simultaneously, at a level that made each one reinforce the others. The intelligence made the honesty deeper. The honesty made the arguments unassailable. The humor made everything bearable, for him and for the room. And the willingness to be genuinely open to change his mind when the evidence demanded it meant that when he didn't change it, you understood that the argument on the other side hadn't been strong enough. He won arguments the way the best people win arguments. Not by being louder, not by being more aggressive, not by refusing to listen, but by doing the thing most people in public discourse have essentially stopped doing. He told the truth. He followed it where it went. He waited for someone to follow him there. And if they couldn't, he sat with the silence, completely comfortable, and waited. Thanks for watching. If Patrice was someone who changed the way you think, leave a comment and tell us which argument of his hit you the hardest. Subscribe if this is the kind of video you want to see more of. See you in the next one.